Welcome, everyone. And for those who weren't here last week, I am talking about a subject that I think is very relevant for all time and certainly for our current time. And this is the idea, the aspect of the teachings that talk about refuge. And this is on offer in our spiritual practice to finally find something reliable, something that we can count on and build on, have as a foundation and a guiding light in our lives. This idea of refuge, protection, safety. And in the Buddha's teachings, many of the suttas, many of the interactions that people have with the Buddha, it concludes with them taking refuge in the Buddha, taking refuge in the Dhamma, the teaching of the Buddha, and taking refuge in the Sangha, the followers of the Buddha. And last week we talked about the Buddha, and this week I'll speak about the Dhamma. And Dhamma is a Pali word. The Sanskrit word is Dharma. If you watched the series of Lost, there was a lot about Dharma in Lost. And sorry, I totally sidetracked myself. Dhamma is a hard word to translate. Very hard. It's so big. Nature comes close, natural order, natural laws, reality, the phenomena, these are all close, capturing Dhamma. And I'm going to begin tonight with this amazing sutta in the Anguttara Nikaya, the numerical discourses. It's in the Book of Threes, and it's Sutta 136. Monks or practitioners, meditators. This is the Buddha speaking. Whether or not there is the arising of a Buddha, this property stands, this steadfastness of the Dhamma, this orderliness of the Dhamma. Number one, all processes are inconstant. They're changing. A Buddha directly awakens to that, breaks through to that. Directly awakening and breaking through to that, he declares it, teaches it, describes it, sets it forth. He reveals it, explains it, and makes it plain. All processes, everything, are in constant changing. Whether or not there is the arising of a Buddha, this property stands, this steadfastness of the Dhamma, this orderliness of the Dhamma. All processes are stressful, they're suffering. A Buddha directly awakens to that, breaks through to that. Directly awakening and breaking through to that, he declares it, teaches it, describes it, sets it forth. He reveals it, explains it, and makes it plain. All processes, all phenomena are stressful, suffering. Whether or not there is the arising of a Buddha, this property stands, this steadfastness of the Dhamma, this orderliness of the Dhamma. All phenomena are not self. A Buddha directly awakens to that, breaks through to that. Directly awakening and breaking through to that, he declares it, teaches it, describes it, sets it forth. He reveals it, explains it, and makes it plain. All phenomena are not self. In this sutta, the Buddha is explaining that these principles of reality, these three, this inconstant, this unreliability, this changing nature of all phenomena. Number two, this stressful and unsatisfactory suffering component of all phenomena. And number three, this insubstantiality, this corelessness, this non-self nature of all phenomena. These three characteristics, this is the Dhamma. Impermanent, unsatisfactory, and not self. In Pali, anicca, dukkha, anatta. And the Buddha is explaining that that's just the way it is. That is reality. And whether or not you were living in a time that a Buddha has arisen and has rediscovered that, penetrated through to the reality and the truth of that, whether there's a Buddha or not, the Buddha didn't make up the Dhamma. The Dhamma is the Dhamma. The Dhamma is nature. The Dhamma is the way it is. And at times, we live in a time where there is a Buddha or there has been a Buddha, and these three characteristics of reality are have been declared. And like the Buddha says, he describes it, he explains it, he reveals it, and it's available to be known. This is incredible. The Buddha did not make up the Dhamma. And the Buddha penetrated the nature of reality. And it's amazing to live at this time where there's so much media and such accessibility to the teachings of the Buddha and to the Dhamma. And then we live in this scientific age where so much of science is just confirming these three characteristics of reality. So I'll just expound on them a little bit, one by one. This Pali word anicca that usually gets translated as impermanent. In Pali, is like a negation. And nicca, this word nicca, it means permanent, lasting, continuous, stable, reliable, immutable, ordered, regular. And the Buddha is saying about reality, it's anicca. It's none of those things. And it's true. All that there is change. That's all there is. Reality is in flux. Reality is in flow. There's nothing that's standalone, stable, inherent. Everything is like a house of cards. Everything is dependently arising. I mean, now in science, you can, when I went to school, I think the nucleus, was that no, the atom. The atom was the smallest unit. And now, of course, we're able to go smaller, down to quarks. Is that what they're called? Quarks. And they can, it's interesting, they can isolate a quartz, but for milliseconds. Because again, even this quartz that's like, so it's smaller than an electron, it's like so infinitesimal, that hard word to say, small, super small, easier word. It can't stand alone. It's there just for, and then it because everything is in relationship to something else. Nothing exists independently, and everything is in flux, and everything is just moving and changing. Even time is an external construct that we put on to mark change. That's all it is. That's what, time is not a essential reality. Change is, and time marks change. Heraclitus, the pre Socrates, 6th century BC, pre-Buddha, had that famous saying. As soon as I say it, many of you will have heard of it. No one steps in the same river twice, because it's not the same river and they're not the same person. Change. That's all there is. And everything is flowing. Everything is in flux. And science completely confirms that at this point. But the Buddha knew this. Like, the Buddha's mind was like an electron microscope. He saw things the way they really are. And when we get in line with reality, we ease our own neurosis and our own suffering. The beautiful metaphor for this is a hot air balloon. When you're in a hot air balloon, it's completely quiet. Why? Because the balloon is moving with the air, with the wind. We hear the wind because we're standing and then the wind's passing. We hear the wind when it passes things that don't move with it. But when you're in a hot air balloon, you're just in flow. And it's completely quiet. And when we look longer and longer and longer at this fixed reality, part of reality, that everything's just changing. It eases. It brings a lot of wisdom and calm into our lives. So the second thing the Buddha says about the Dhamma that he has penetrated is this aspect of reality a lot, because of this anicca component of reality, is that it's unsatisfactory. There's stress, there's friction, there's stress, and suffering. I'll read a sutta, part of a sutta, the beginning of a sutta from the Connected Discourses in book 38, Sutta 14. And this whole book, this whole section of the Connected Discourses are discussions between Sariputta, who's sort of the right-hand person of the Buddha. He had 2 chief male disciples and 2 chief female disciples. And Sariputta is one of his chief male disciples. And so this is a discussion between Sariputta and actually his nephew, Jambukadaka. Super easy to say. It actually means rose apple eater. Jambukadaka. And Jambukadaka was one of these wandering ascetics that I talked about last week, that there were so many in the time of the Buddha in India. So Sariputta's nephew goes to him and asks, "Friend Sariputta, it is said suffering, this second aspect of the Dhamma, the second characteristic of all reality, dukkha. And then he asks Sariputta, what now is suffering? And Sariputta answers, there are, friend, these 3 kinds of dukkha, these 3 kinds of suffering. The suffering inherently due inherent in painful feeling. Dukkha, dukkha, actually. The suffering inherent in formations, sankharas, conditions. The suffering inherent in change. These are the three kinds of suffering. So the first kind of suffering, dukkha, dukkha, is like really intense suffering. And we've all had that in our lives, a death, a divorce, a serious illness, a loss of job. These are the intense, the traumatic events in our lives. This is the suffering. And then the second kind of suffering is just life conditions, having a mind, having a body. There are parts of that cause suffering. And the third is this change, this friction, as everything is perishing. This inherently is not peaceful. Dukkha. And the third characteristic of the Dhamma that the Buddha talks about, these first two, I found, when I came to the Buddha's teachings, very intuitive and lined up with my experience completely, and completely relatable. Like, yeah, for sure, everything's changing. That's obvious. It from a sort of a big scale to a small scale, and suffering, yeah, definitely could relate to that. And this third one, not intuitive and completely unique to the Buddha's teachings. This idea of anatta, this idea of, gets translated as non-self. And you can also just think of it as like insubstantiality or corelessness. It's that there isn't a fixed, independent, permanent, or solid person, self, being. I think lots of us have like a little homunculus, sort of behind our eyes, like we think driving the ship, and it's not there. It's not like that. It's just not. And this is not so intuitive, because we very much feel like self, like I'm making these choices. I picked out what to wear today. Well, I didn't have much choice, but and what to eat, and I've picked where I live and what job I do and who I got married to and blah blah blah. But it's just not the way that we think that it is. And this anatta, again, the and it is a negation. And the atta, this is actually, I think the Buddha picked this particular word in response to the religious environment that he was in, where in Hinduism there was the atta, and that is the eternal soul, and Atman and Brahman. And the Buddha is pointing to it. It's not like that. And I'm always quoting his very first teaching, this middle way. And one of the main ways that the Buddha taught this middle way, again, it was in response to the ideology that he was immersed in, which is current in our day as well. This idea of either nihilism, which would a nihilism, which would be materialism, when you're alive and you die and that's it, done. Materialism and nihilism, or eternalism, which also is very prevalent today. This idea of having a soul and then it will go to be in a heaven and for all of eternity. So the Buddha taught this middle way between these two ideologies, and it is this anatta. And it's not that there's nothing here. That's not what he's teaching. It's not all an illusion. It's just a big dream, and we're going to wake up from it at some point. No, there is something here. I've got there's a mind here and a body here, and when I break my leg, Scott Ward doesn't hurt. I hurt because it's here in this system, but there's not a self. What I take to be, it's not the way I typically take myself to be. We do not have as much agency as we think that we have. Things are not as fixed as we think they are. It just is not that way. And when you look deeper and deeper, you see that. And there are just so many layers to it, and there's so many angles and ways to look at it. And with all of the Buddha's teachings, initially we learn it kind of intellectually and conceptually, and then it needs to go deeper, and it needs to become an experience. And this is an experience you'll only have in very, very deep meditation, where the mind is very, very, very still. But before that, you can really play at the conceptual level with this idea of non-self, and it's very useful. Very, very useful. My daughter, almost 15 years ago, took a course at Simon Fraser University in her psychology degree called The Self. And it was psychology, and they looked at from so many different angles. And it was like really clear from so many different angles that the self is a socially constructed thing. Mm. It's not what we typically take it to be, and what we think we experience and feel. It's just not that way. It's completely conditioned. The language I speak, the food I eat, the clothes I wear, and the worldview that I have, I'm a product of my culture. I'm a product of the time and the place where I was born. I'm not the self I take myself to be. And that's true for all of us. Yeah, there's just so many ways to look at it. There's an experiment that it's still getting talked about, that a neuroscientist that's no longer alive. His name's Benjamin Libet, Libet, and he worked at University of California, San Francisco, and he did an experiment looking at. I mean, it's so exciting because science is so interested now in free will and consciousness and how how the brain works. And there's equipment now and that we can get empirical data about aspects of the brain and the human lived experience. So this experiment was in 1983. And I mean, it's still getting talked about. And of course, it's been reproduced many, many times. And in this experiment, Benjamin Libet was looking at free will and this idea of volition, this idea of self. Who's driving the bus? And so I'm not going to go into all the details of the experiment, but there were three measurements, time measurements. And the first time measurement was with EEG, and it was measuring the neuro activity of, about to make a a physical movement. The second measurement is the one that's very interesting. And it was people pushing a button when they were conscious that they were going to make this movement. And the third measurement is the movement. And the movement was very simple. The third time was just the movement itself. So that was picked to be 0. And so the movement would be the participant was instructed to move their finger or move their wrist. The movement didn't matter, but just a movement. And they were given a time span, several minutes, 10 minutes. And in that 10 minutes, they could do the movement once, they could do it 6 times, they could, and just random. So they're sitting there and, at some point they're going to move their finger because that's what they were told to do in the experiment. And the EEGs on their cortex, on their scalp. And what's fascinating is that the neuroactivity to do this movement was happening considerably longer before the person was conscious that they were going to now move their finger. So you get that? So there's this activity in the brain to initiate this movement. That was about 500 milliseconds before the movement would happen. But the person became conscious that they were going to do this movement 300 milliseconds after all this neuroactivity. So the neuroactivity happened before someone was conscious that they were making the decision to do this movement. This is wild stuff. So that your brain is doing stuff to make movements before you're aware that you're going to make that movement. It really brings a lot into question.
Can you say those timelines from start to end?
So there's neuroactivity that I'm going to move my finger 300 milliseconds before I am conscious that I've made the decision that I'm going to move my finger.
So it's delayed the consciousness of moving the finger?
Yeah, the awareness that I'm going to make this movement happens after neuroactivity is initiating the movement. And we take ourselves to be for sure that I make a conscious decision that I'm going to open the fridge, and then all this neuroactivity will start happening to direct my muscles to open the fridge, right? That's the way we think things are happening. But no. And you can start to see that in meditation. You can. Oh gosh, the order is not the order that I thought it was. Another, I'm just coming at this from different angles and want to shake up the way we just assume that, because it feels like I'm driving the bus, but not to the extent that we tend to think. I need to try and keep it simple. Okay, I'm going to read from a book. And this book actually is so wild. Tony Clevenger recommended this book to me. It's called Why Buddhism is True. It's by Robert Wright. And he's a really mostly evolutionary psychologist, also religious studies, also an academic. Okay, and so this is all in this idea of a self and who's making the decisions and who's making the choices. And this is another way to come at it. It's really from evolutionary psychology, and it's like cognitive modularity. That we have these modules in our brain, and they're running the show, So I'll read. I hope it's really clear. After all, when you, the self, when you're deciding whether to indulge in, say, chocolate, this is his example, doesn't it feel as if there's a rational you that's pondering the question? There's a self, a kind of judge who hears the arguments for and against buying the chocolate. On the one hand, you're a few pounds overweight. Plus, eating the chocolate this late in the day could make it harder to sleep. On the other hand, if you ate the chocolate, you'd feel energetic and could get some work done. Plus, you deserve a treat, given how hard you worked yesterday. Thanks in part to the chocolate you ate. Okay. I mean, we can all relate to this, right? Like, I don't know, should I? Okay. So having considered the arguments on both sides, you, the self, the judge, render a verdict. Being a stern judge, you decide that no, you cannot have the chocolate today. Or maybe on another day, being a lenient judge, you decide that you have indeed earned the chocolate bar. The court is adjourned, or rather, court is recessed. After you buy the chocolate, you will begin adjudicating the question of whether to wait until you get home before eating it. Either way, it does feel, and this is this feeling, it does feel as if there's a moment when you decide. So what's wrong with describing it this way, as a rational you adjudicating the case? I, the writer, Robert Wright, I once asked this question of Rob Kurzban, and he's also a psychologist, evolutionary psychologist, Rob Kurzban. Since Kurzban is among the psychologists who have suggested that maybe the self doesn't exist, I was pretty sure he'd have a way of describing the chocolate decision that didn't involve some rational you being the judge. And indeed, when I asked him what's wrong with saying something like, I considered the pros and cons and decided not to eat the chocolate, he said that, strictly speaking, you should put it more like this. There were certain systems in your head that were designed to be motivated to eat the high calorie foods. See, this is the evolutionary angle. And those systems had certain kinds of motives or beliefs or representations. And there were other systems in your head that have motivations associated with long-term health. And those systems have certain beliefs about the chocolate. In the end, modules of the second kind, modules focused on the long term, inhibited the behavior that was being facilitated by the short-term modules. In other words, neither kind of module was more rational than the other. They just had different goals, and on this particular day, one was stronger than the other. Yeah. So it's just another angle. It is very conceivable. You know, there's a lot of neuroscientists, a lot of psychologists, not religious people, not Buddhists, that are pointing to this non-existence of the self the way that we take it to be. Yeah. And I mean, just we also, I mean, just on a lighter note, I mean, haven't you opened a photo album and looked at some rendition of yourself in some outrageous outfit and be like, who is it? Like what was I thinking? I mean, we can all, yeah, who is this self? I mean, I'm like, I could not be more different than the way I was in younger years. I literally couldn't. There's no way. Okay. I was like fundamentalist. Yeah. Like, yeah.
She was pictured.
Oh, wow. Yeah. wild.
I'm just joking.
Seriously, what was I thinking? Woof. Wow. Yeah. Back those shoulder pads and these huge earrings.
Oh.
Yeah. Okay. I need to end. I seriously need to end. The Dhamma, there's something that gets chanted about the Dhamma. It's in the suttas over and over and over and over. In Pali, we say about this the Dhamma sanditiko. It's apparent here and now. You can see it. You can discover it. It's available. Apparent here and now. Sanditiko. Akaliko. It's timeless. Always relevant. And when you penetrate fully to the Dhamma, it's outside of time. Yeah. Sanditiko, akaliko, ehipasiko. Ehipasiko means come and see. Come and investigate for yourself. This is to be discovered for yourself. Sanditiko, akaliko, ehipasiko, opanayiko. It's leading onwards or leading inwards. And Pachat come Veditibo. I can't do it without doing the whole thing. Sanditiko, Akaliko, Ehipasiko, Opanayiko, Pachatang Veditabo Winyuhi. To be experienced individually by the wise. This is the Dhamma. Yeah. And I'll just end with a beautiful sutta from the Connected Discourses, the Book of 56, Sutta 48. Medicators, suppose the earth was entirely covered with water and a person threw a yoke through like a hula hoop with a single hole into it. The east wind wafts it west, the west wind wafts it east, the north wind wafts it south, and the south wind wafts it north. And there was a one-eyed turtle who popped up once every 100 years. What do you think, meditators? Would that one-eyed turtle popping up once every 100 years still poke its neck through the hole in that yoke? And his switched on listeners said, "It's unlikely, sir." And this is important. This is the Buddha speaking. That's how unlikely it is to get reborn as a human being. And that's how unlikely it is for a Buddha to arise in the world, a perfected one, a fully awakened Buddha. And that's how unlikely it is for the teaching and training proclaimed by a Buddha to shine in the world. And now, meditators, you have been reborn as a human being. A Buddha has arisen in the world, a perfected one, a fully awakened Buddha. And the teaching and the training proclaimed by the Buddha shines in the world. That's why you should practice meditation.